So I'm Alan Winters. I'm a professor of economics here in the University of Sussex, which is located in the University of Sussex Business School. And as the slide says, I was the creator and former director of something called the UK Trade Policy Observatory, which is a group actually across several schools in the university studying international trade policy. It was Brexit that got us going on this, in a sense. Well, most of us have spent a lot of our lives studying trade policy. Brexit suddenly made the world interested. And now, in a sense, what we've got is the question about, now we have Brexit, what do we do next? And that's where Global Britain fits in. I'm an economist, so I'm only going to talk about the economics. There are interesting sort of security and foreign policy issues tied up with Global Britain, but I'm a layman when it comes to those. So the sort of, I said, the title is what does Global Britain add up to economically? But an alternative title would be Global Britain versus Global Britain, a tale of two styles. Global Britain on the left, capital letters, is one thing, and that's what we've sort of invented over the last few years. Global Britain with a lowercase g as just an ordinary adjective is what the Brits have been doing for centuries. And in a sense, the two are quite opposed in their style, if not in their intention. So when we talk about Global Britain with a capital G, it is part of the Brexit campaign, as I'll come on to talk about. It's sort of puff and bluster. It's saying Britain used to rule the world, and frankly, we're still here, and we're ever so important, and you should be paying attention. Global Britain with a lowercase g is something that has just been going on for a long time. It's a long tradition of international engagement that the British Isles, the four nations of the United Kingdom, have been engaging in, as I said, for centuries. So what's the origins of Global Britain, the long-term thing? It's been with us at least since the 17th century. British explorers, British commerce down the side of Africa, through the Mediterranean and so on. Now, some of this globalization, this Global Britain was not very tasteful, and that's something we ought to face up to. But it was there, it was a phenomenon. So Britain was a major trader in the world economy, and indeed a number of the sort of practices that we have in international trade have arisen from British practices or sometimes British treaties. Britain provided capital to much of the world and again invented, to some extent, sort of capital market institutions. And Britain was a source of considerable emigration, Brits moving out of Britain elsewhere in the world, and occasionally has seen periods of significant immigration. But in a sense, I'm just pointing out that Britain has had mobility of people globally, as well as of goods and capital. The UK and the US basically designed the post-war trading institutions, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which morphed into the World Trade Organization, also the World Bank, the IMF, and to a significant extent, the United Nations. These institutions are perhaps looking a little bit tired now, but the structure, the idea of a rules-based system in which we were all participants and equity holders, as it were, stems back to that period with really UK and US policymakers at its heart. Now, we've been a global power for sort of 300-400 years, but of course our relative size has declined dramatically. But while Britain has declined relative to the rest of the world, it's maintained its tradition of pretty open markets, actually pretty faithfully. We've had little hiccups in the 1930s, in the 1960s, 70s, where Britain didn't trade as freely as it might, but by and large, we kept up the tradition. And this is just a little graph of the British share of world trade, of global trade, since 1850 up to round about the present. The darker line is of manufacturing, and the lower line all merchandise goods. But you can see that in 1850, Britain, as the preeminent industrial power, was an absolutely predominant force in world trade. That has declined as other countries have industrialized and developed, and international trade technology, the business of doing trade, has become much more efficient. And so that we are now down to something like 3%, 4% of world trade. But as I say, that in a sense is global Britain in a world that has grown dramatically. So what's the origins of global Britain with a capital G? And this goes back really to the campaign for Brexit, which really kicked off in the very beginning of 2016. In order to get Brexit sort of through in the referendum that the UK had in the middle of 2016, the Leave side of the campaign had essentially to bring together two very, very different groups of people. There were a number of people who thought the world is a dangerous place. We've got all these foreigners coming. We've got imports competing with our industry. Frankly, globalization is a bit of a pain. And why can't we go back to the good old days when trade was expensive and they pretty much left us alone and we could just get on and do stuff? And I've sort of characterized these as Little Englanders. And they wanted less trade and certainly less migration. That was a real touchstone in the campaign. They thought that being within the European Union obliged Britain to keep its borders open to European goods and people. And they frankly were fed up of it. There was another group of people who objected to the European Union, and these are people I would characterize as free traders, and they are the people who thought that the European Union was a nasty protectionist cabal of continental Europeans who stopped Britain from being the sort of swashbuckling trader that it had been over the 18th and 19th centuries. That they tied our hands, they had protection on agriculture, for instance, where Britain had traditionally imported food very cheaply from the rest of the world. The Europeans protected it. And they wanted to see much more trade. They wanted to get out of Europe to pull down the barriers, if you like, to Britain's trade with the rest of the world. And you can see that these two groups do not lie comfortably in the same bed. And the trick during the referendum campaign was essentially to be extremely vague about what Brexit meant, to be really quite clear among the leadership there. They were not going to define what Brexit was, so that in a sense each side could believe it would be what it wanted. Now, the truth of the matter is that Brexit puts up barriers to trade, and it also actually reduces UK influence in the world. And having once achieved Brexit, which became rather associated with cutting migration, pulling back from the amount of imports that came in from Europe and so on, essentially to keep the free traders happy, or maybe they were even becoming politically more important, Global Britain became a slogan to which they could relate. So suddenly the government at the time invented this notion, Global Britain with a capital G. It arrived in shortly after the referendum with Theresa May as Prime Minister, but it was never really defined until 2018, and I'll come on to that definition in a minute. It's mostly a welcome statement of principle, that Britain ought to be fairly global. It's the way we have lived over many years, and it's basically done us pretty well. But it's no sense, is it, a sort of plan of action. So what does the government say? This is the definition from the 2018 document that defined global Britain. There's a reference down here on the URL. Global Britain's about reinvesting in our relationships, championing the rules-based international order, and demonstrating that Britain is outward-looking, open, and confident on the world stage. And the question really is, well, how useful is that as a statement? Now, it means nothing really until it's clothed in action. It adds up to nothing until you actually start to do those things. Now, what are these things? There are 4 things in that definition. In fact, most of you will think that the Brits are far too confident on the world stage. And the University of Harvard wrote a report fairly recently called Finding Global Britain. Its biggest single message was the Brits ought to be a bit more humble in international relations, and then they will get a bit further. So, I'm not going to talk about this. It's not part of the economics, but it's something actually that very certainly a successful Britain is going to have to do without. I'm not going to talk about the the politics of relationships, but I am going to talk about what global Britain means within that, the middle 2 elements of this definition that I've underlined. Championing the rules-based international order and demonstrating that the UK is open and outward-looking. So that's basically what I'm going to talk about. And until a week ago, I was going to stop there, but really rather unsportingly, the British government issued a paper last week called Global Britain in the Competitive Age. And this is the integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy, but it's got Global Britain in the title. Interestingly, it's barely got Global Britain within the document. I think it's true to say there are only 9 references to the words Global Britain in all 114 pages. But there's a paragraph that says Global Britain is best defined by actions rather than words, just what I said in my slide. Sustaining the UK's openness as a society and an economy, exactly as we had in Global Britain with a lowercase g. More robust position on security and deterrence. In general, people feel that the new policy is actually shaping up quite sensibly. The government has been moderately sensible about this, but it's not my special subject, so I'm not going to talk very much about that. And a renewed commitment to the UK as a force for good in the world, which is sort of back to the rules-based system. A determination to seek multilateral solutions. So that is part of what this document, Global Britain, actually says. So, I mean, in a sense, that's the most recent definition. And nearly all the references to Global Britain in this document actually are in a little box about page 58, I think, where it says putting trade at the heart of global Britain. In other words, the only place that they really were able to pin down a definition was in terms of international trade. And it talks about championing free and fair trade, invigorate the WTO, negotiating free trade agreements, securing access and influencing rules for trading partners, promoting exports. All governments love to promote exports, and enabling developing countries integration into the global economy. In general, nothing much wrong with that, although there is something of an irony in this. If we think about the second of the items, negotiating bilateral and free trade agreements, in a sense, FTAs and globalization, free trade agreements and globalization, are very, very uneasy bedfellows. They're often confused, and that really is not very helpful. The point about a free trade agreement is it actually discriminates between partners. The multilateral system created after the Second World War was really hung around the idea that discrimination was a thing that drove nations apart and ultimately ended up in war. And that what we actually needed was a trading system where every country was treated the same. Every country from which you import faced the same tariffs. That's a way of actually trying to ensure you buy from the most efficient source. A free trade agreement, quite conversely, says to one particular partner or a few partners, we'll reduce our tariffs on imports from you. So, reducing tariffs is generally a good thing. But if you reduce them on only a few suppliers, a few partners, there's a risk that people in your country start to buy goods from those sources that no longer face the tariff, that have this sort of tax advantage given to them, rather than those that offer the best deal. So in fact, there are reasons to worry about free trade agreements actually not really enhancing globalism at all. Typically also free trade agreements don't address sort of the complex issues of regulations and trade facilitation. They typically do very little for services. So it's important in a sense to keep globalism and free trade agreements separate. It's only if you get around to signing free trade agreements with nearly all your partners do they sort of merge into globalization, because suddenly you're making everybody a preferred partner. They all get lower tariffs. Okay, so that's sort of the, as it were, the intellectual background. What I want to do now is actually just talk about Britain and globalism, from the point of view of 4 different measures, which I'm going to skip through fairly quickly, and then sort of round up by asking, so where does global Britain with a capital G land us? So the first question is, international trade is where the government put its faith for global Britain. And the question is, why trade? I mean, why all this fuss about trading? Well, actually, trading is a really fundamental part of human society. And to prove that to you, just to get you to imagine that you lived in a village of 300 people and you had no trade at all with anybody else. No means to buy anything from outside, or in order to buy, to sell anything to outside. What would your life be like? Would you manage to have a doctor? Would you manage to have bananas in the winter or what have you? The answer is just about no one survives, and no one survives with anything remotely resembling a modern lifestyle without a great deal of trade. International trade is just the same phenomenon. So it's clearly at a much bigger scale than a village. It's clearly actually less important, because if you can trade entirely across Britain, there are still quite a lot of things you can get from other villages. But once we throw it open to the world and trade with the world, there are even more things that we can get. So trade gives us specialization. We specialize in producing stuff that we can really produce well, and the rest of the world is keen to buy from us because we produce it really well. And in return, we stop doing some other stuff and import from them. Gives us economies of scale. If you're in a village of 300, you don't get any economies of scale at all, full stop. But even if you're in a country like Belgium, you don't really get big economies of scale in most manufacturing processes. For really big scale, Boeing, Airbus, you need a world market. We also fully understand now that international trade, one of the really big benefits that it produces is getting inputs into your activities from outside. Being able to buy the right sort of seeds, buy the right sort of inputs into your manufacturing, and also to get technologies. And when we study opening up trade, improving conditions of trade in developing countries, it's increasingly becoming clear that the real way that trade is boosting incomes in developing countries is by improved conditions for using inputs from the rest of the world. And then finally, competitive pressures, that you open your economy up and there might be somebody who produces some of these goods more efficiently than you do. And that causes some firms locally to go out of business. But the idea is their resources can move to their export sectors. It puts competitive pressure on firms so they sort of organize themselves a bit better. We call it X inefficiency. It's quite difficult to pin down what's going on. But typically, for firms that are being outcompeted, but not being outcompeted by a mile, competition tends to increase their efficiency. They try harder and very often succeed. And then also we are likely to get more innovation. So these are all things that you get by trade, and typically they come in stronger measure, if you like, the wider, the broader the trade that you do is. Two little notes to do this. First, trade depends on differences. If we all had exactly the same ability to produce exactly the same goods, why on earth would you go to the trouble of carting them around the world? Actually, the point is that trade exploits differences between countries. So you must not get too hung up on the idea it's not fair, they have some advantage over us. The point is, if they have an advantage over us, we want to try and make something different and buy whatever it is we're talking about from them. Second thing is trade requires confidence. Building up relations to have a market relationship in a different country, designing goods perhaps that will suit the other country. A simple example, putting the steering wheel in a car on the correct side. It all takes money. It all takes investment. You don't do it unless you are confident that not only will you be able to sell this year, but you will be able to sell next year and the year after. And so trade needs to be couched around with a sort of set of agreements that are going to stick so that you have the confidence to invest in trading and investing in the goods and services that are tradable. Okay, so how does Britain compare with other countries in terms of trade? This is, this is just a graph of exports and imports expressed relative to gross domestic product. That's the total amount of output in the economy. And it refers to basically the OECD in Paris, their set of members, plus a few key emerging markets. And I've just highlighted, you can read them along, along the bottom if your eyesight's good. I've highlighted a few of these elements. The dots are exports over GDP, the diamonds are imports over GDP. Notice they go pretty much together. First, who have we got down at this lowest end, lowest share of exports and imports? We got the big economies, all right? The United States, Brazil, Japan, Indonesia, China. They don't need to trade very much, precisely because being huge economies, they've got lots of things that they can make efficiently themselves. At this other end, we've got Luxembourg, we've got Ireland, and we know that these very small economies are the ones that have very high ratios of trade. Exports here more than twice the size of GDP. The UK is down here in the middle, round about the OECD average, a little bit less open than the European average. But remember, the European Union contains quite a lot of small countries anyway. So, in terms of trade, the UK is reasonably open, given that it's a relatively large economy. But there is a question then about who do you trade with? That previous slide doesn't deal with it. And this is just to point out to you that we really got very strong evidence, that trade erodes with distance. The further a partner is away, the less you trade with it. And so what I've done here is ask about distance relative, just distance from the UK relative to the UK's distance from Europe. So not just France, 21 miles, but Europe as an average. These are actually trade-weighted average distances. And so if we treat sort of distance to Europe as one, how much further away are groups, I've done it here for America and Asia Pacific. The answer is that the American markets are on average 7 times further away than European markets to the UK. The Asian markets a bit over 9 times further away than the UK. And what we find is that means that if everything else was the same, the size of the economy, the competitiveness of the economy and so on, trade between the UK and the Americas would be here about 25% of what it was with Europe in services. Services don't depend so much on distance, particularly now with digitization. 20% less, so only 20% of the value in manufacturing, slightly over 10% for agriculture, well under 10% for primary goods, iron ore and the things. The truth of the matter is that America and Asia are a very long way away, and so they are not natural trading partners for the UK. The UK's natural trading partner is Europe. And I've just presented a few little diagrams to show you the share of British trade between Europe, the America, and Asia. It's in 1999, 2008, 2019. I've sort of chosen basically decades, years, roughly a decade apart, but where we didn't have a great disturbance in the world economy. And what you see here in imports of services, imports of goods, exports of services, exports of goods, Europe is the predominant partner. Europe is perhaps declining a little bit in importance. The Americas wobble about a bit. And in 3 out of the 4 cases, Asia is taking an increasing share of British trade. That's a reflection of the fact that Asia is growing. Everything else is not equal. Asia is larger and it's growing faster. So basically you can see that these British trade more or less reflects what we had in the previous slide, that the closer the market, the more you are going to trade with them. And in fact, that has always been the case. This is another historical figure going right back to 1700. So some of the data are a little bit on the dodgy side, but they're roughly right. And this area here in blue is the share of British trade that goes to or from Europe. And here we've got 50%. You can see over most of history, Europe has accounted for around 50% of trade. A bit lower over the sort of peak period for the British Empire. But then getting back in the 2000s towards well over 50%, but nothing like as large as it was 250 years ago. So not only is Europe close and who we trade with now, it actually has more or less always been like that. Now just go back to this diagram. I just want to point out one final thing about this diagram on the shape of European trade, and that is to look at exports of services. Exports of services, the share going to Europe is roughly constant. The share in the Americas not growing very slightly. The share going to Asia is basically static. Now the problem is that exports of services are the real key element of British trade. And this diagram on the left here asks how are British exports divided up between goods and services. And you can see from 99 to 2008 to 2019, the share of services is growing very, very strongly. So here we've got a little bit of a problem for the Brits. we've got one area where we really seem to do very well. It's exports of services. It's the one area where Asia, the growing market in the world, is not taking more of a larger share of our trade. And sort of, in a sense, that suggests there's missing opportunities. It might mean that there's a fundamental problem to be addressed. But it means that it's just not automatic that Britain out of Europe is going to boom away selling its exports in Asia. In fact, the UK is by a long way the most service-oriented of all the major economies in the world in terms of exports. This is just the share of exports in total exports. The UK right here on the left, 44%, nearly half. It's slightly higher than that now in the data for 2019. So Britain is a services exporter. Britain, now I haven't really got much time to describe this, but this is asking how protected is the British market for services relative to the average of the OECD countries. If it was the same as the OECD average level of protection, these bars would reach 100. As it is, they're all below 100. And these are just a series of sectors that the OECD is able to measure service barriers in. The truth is that Britain is a very efficient exporter of services. It's also a very liberal market for other people's services. This is a figure which I'm not going to talk about very much. It's just to say the previous figure refers to the period when the UK was part of the European Union. The European Union has done a great deal to liberalize service trade within the Union, and Britain has now dropped out of that. And if you just, this is the same set of sectors, and just look at two of the figures. The triangles here are the average level of barriers of protection, if you like, the trade in services between members of the European Union, and these diamonds are the average level of restrictions for trade between the European Union, or the European Union's imports, and other suppliers around the world. The answer is that the other suppliers around the world always face much higher barriers getting into European service sectors than do members of the European Union. Britain has, through Brexit, jumped from having these triangles to having these diamonds. Okay, so let's move on to migration. Why migrate? Same story in a sense as trade. You know, you want to take your skills to where they're most valuable. You want to be able to import skills where they're missing at home. But even without worrying about skills, migration turns out to be an immensely powerful force for increasing output in the world, in the sense economic welfare in the world. The point basically is that the principal determinant of how productive a firm is which country is it in. Why are developed countries so much more productive? I mean, one, they have more capital equipment. They often have better technology. They also have better institutions. So we have to spend less time worrying about how the government is going to treat us, less time hunting around to find capital to invest, and so on. And for those reasons, you take a worker out of a developing country, you lose rather little. You take the same worker and put him or her in the developed country, you gain quite a lot. And that turns out to be the biggest single element of increased globalization that would boost world incomes, actually just moving people from less productive countries to more productive countries. Now, it doesn't happen because countries are societies, they are groups, they are teams of people, and you know, they are a little bit reluctant to invest all their money in better schools and better roads, only to have the whole benefit go to people from outside. That's, if you like, a bit of an issue. But the truth of the matter is that if you wanted to increase world output and world income, the single simplest thing you could do is allow people to move from low productivity countries to high productivity countries. Most of these benefits actually accrue to the migrants themselves. They earn most of that extra production that they do by moving, but not completely. There are benefits to both to host and home countries. So how does Britain fare in terms of migration? This is the share of foreign-born population in the population, again, of OECD countries. And here, here we've got Britain, again, in the middle at 13.7, exactly the same as the US, in fact. But we've got a number of countries that are much more open to migration. And Luxembourg, the little one again, is the biggest, but Switzerland, nearly 30%, Canada, over 20%. And this is just a figure to point out that Britain has had a period of 20 years, slightly over 20 years now, quite high migration. These figures are for all migration from non-EU sources, this is the blue one, and EU sources, this one. And this is net migration looking at immigration minus emigration from the UK. Britain is always a net loser in that regard. So here we've got immigration from non-EU sources increasing over the last 5 years, immigration from EU sources declining very strongly. Britain is still actually pretty much got the same flows of immigrants coming in, still relatively open in world terms, but a quite significant change in composition. And then one area that would perhaps interest most of you, since I trust interested in coming to study in Sussex, international student mobility. This is the proportion of international students in total enrollment. Again, highest in Luxembourg. Luxembourg is so small, there's just not enough students to run a university, so they have to have people coming in. But here's Britain, actually very high among the among countries. And the countries that have got these highest proportions are the UK, New Zealand, Australia, and then interestingly Switzerland. So in terms of migration, Britain is fairly open, fairly global with a capital G. What about foreign direct investment? People in one country investing in firms in another country. The UK here, fairly much towards the top of the group, both in inflows, what comes into Britain, and outflows, what goes out of Britain. So Britain is a global investor. Canada and a number of other countries, Ireland, Luxembourg, are higher. But again, among the major economies, the UK is actually just about the most open. And just a note to say, again, this is the restrictiveness, how many restrictions are on inflows of foreign direct investment, again, measured by OECD. The UK, very low level relative to most countries of restrictions on inflows of foreign direct investment. So again, in outcomes, in policy, the UK is pretty global with a lowercase g. Finally, aid. An important part of the world economy over the last 30 years or so, 25 years, has been overseas development assistance, foreign aid. Britain is in 2019, a very good performer in this regard. The UN said it would be desirable if everyone gave 0.7% of their gross national income in terms of aid. Britain now does so. The countries over here are typically much smaller, with the exception of Turkey, which has got able to use its aid flows so far as trying to alleviate suffering in Syria is concerned. Excuse me, it's not usually at that point in these diagrams. But again, here in 2019, Britain, pretty global, pretty focused on the world. Okay, so that's how we've done with global Britain on a lowercase g. How are we doing on global Britain with a uppercase G? This is what we said. This is what the government has done. This government in Britain got Brexit done, but it increased trade barriers and it's going to cut trade by 15 or 20%. It's reduced labour mobility with the European Union, and it has also created innumerable loose ends that are going to occupy policymakers for decades. And if you read the papers, you'll know that Europe and the UK are squabbling about how to do trade with Northern Ireland at the moment and that sort of thing. The UK has signed 30 new trade agreements in the last few years, but they are just designed to get separate trade agreements for the UK with all those countries that had trade agreements with the EU and which therefore included the UK before Brexit. They are just about replicating, and the quote from the government is to reproduce the effects of trading agreements that previously applied. The UK has signed one new trade agreement with Japan, but actually the truth of the matter is that was also a replication. The UK has twice in the last year threatened to break an international treaty. And this is, at least for many of us, a very, very startling position. Britain has generally had a very firm view about abiding by international law, international treaties. It's written in black and white in the definitions of global Britain, and yet this government has twice threatened to do it. It's also the case that the World Trade Organization dispute settlement system is basically broken. The European Union and a few like-minded countries got together to create a temporary patch-up. The UK has explicitly chosen not to join that. So the UK has not joined a sort of arbitration system, if you like, that would help trade flowing when countries get into disputes. And also, as some of you will know, just recently, the UK has cut its aid flows actually by about 30%, from 0.7% of gross national income to 0.5% of gross national income. So in fact, global Britain with a capital G has basically gone backwards. Okay, so just to summarize, Britain is pretty global economically. All those figures I showed you, Britain does engage heavily with the rest of the world. It has been so for decades, and actually not much is changing. This is just a little graph of British exports as a percentage of GDP since 1970. There are wobbles in it for sure, but it frankly is not much higher in 2019 than it was in 1977. And so in a sense, global Britain with a small g is just ticking along fairly much as usual. Now, global Britain with a capital G continues the tradition. It's a fine statement of principle. I'd much rather have it than I wouldn't. But in terms of action, global Britain with a capital G has got very few action points. And actually, when we look at it in the last year, maybe Britain has even gone backwards. Now, is it the case that this is just a temporary aberration and we'll get back to the tradition? I don't know. I rather hope so. But in fact, for all the puff, global Britain is actually associated with something that may be a rather weak or a weakening of Britain's commitment to engagement with the rest of the world. The job of academics is to point out things that could go wrong and could be done better in an analytical way, and that in a sense is what I've done. Britain is still a great deal more open than most countries, economically and also socially, and that seems to be a good state of affairs. But we absolutely cannot be complacent and not be fooled by this statement about global Britain with a capital G. And there, a bit overrun, I apologize for that. I've finished. So I'm going to open up now for questions. I thank you for listening, and you can follow up on the work of the UK Trade Policy Observatory in that URL at the bottom. The idea is that you submit questions through the questions and answer function. So I'm going to turn, oh no, I'm not going to turn this on now, and just wait. Yeah, please do ask questions. I've had a couple of things that have been whispered to me in preparation for the lecture. So let me just say a little bit about those while people are typing in questions. I mean, the first one is, Britain is always going to be a European country. I mean, in a sense, that's what I've shown. And for international trade, that is just inevitable. It's just part of the technology. But is the European Union going to be a red flag, a sort of a provocation to the British political system forever? Or is it just that we are at the moment sort of going through the aftermath of Brexit, and therefore we have a lot of rhetoric that is basically rather anti-European? I think the answer is that we are going to revert to having a more constructive relationship with the European Union. Now, I can't say that with total confidence because I've been making predictions about UK-EU relations for 5 years, starting off with, it would seem to me as an economist pretty silly to pursue Brexit, so perhaps it won't happen, but it did. So in a sense, what I'm saying is, economically, it makes a huge amount of sense to repair the relationship with Europe, do a lot of things in common with Europe. I think that will prevail. I think that's where we will get to in the next 2 or 3 years, just because people like having more stuff and more income than otherwise. But I guess my track record is such that you should not necessarily take it from me that it's bound to happen. So I've got, what steps do you think our government should make to help soothe international relations? Well, I think the first thing is, in a sense, what the Harvard report said is that it behave with a bit more humility. And that actually would help a lot. Britain is going to become influential if it can operate with like-minded countries. Now, that would typically include Europe, but also places like Canada, Australia, Japan. And those are the sort of group of countries with which we are most similar in terms of size as well. So I think the first thing to do really is just to be more cooperative, less bombastic. I think the cut in aid is very unfortunate. I hope and pray it will be restored soon. And I hope the government will get back to the traditional British view, which is you do not break the rules. Now, if you signed up to a bum set of rules, you're stuck with it, find a different solution. You just don't break them. But again, that's Alan the rationalist speaking, and it doesn't always work out like that. So, trade focus on Indo-Pacific tilt, accession to the CPTPP. Well, in a sense, go back to those figures I had on how trade erodes over space. The CPTPP is a long, long way away. They will not become our main partners, but we will not become their main partners. Getting into CPTPP because we think we can dominate it is just totally misguided. It's basically a Pacific organization. The Japanese, the Australians are not going to welcome the Brits trying to tell them how to run their affairs. It might be useful. It will cut a few tariffs and make it easy. We have only one agreement with CPTPP rather than several individual ones, although we already have free trade agreements with several members. But you can't, it's just not going to transform British trade. It also comes along with digital rules that we may or may not like, the government likes, but I don't know whether the public likes. So, I think it's sort of somewhat useful, but it actually is not the solution to getting Britain to be a world trader. Is it likely that barriers to trade with Asia-Pacific in services will change in the near future post-Brexit? What's preventing the UK from success in that market? Look, services are not protected by tariffs, they're protected by regulations. Regulations typically have grown up from someone trying to prevent harm. There are regulations over food standards, so people don't get poisoned, over banking standards, so banks don't run off with your money, and so on. Regulations are deeply ingrained in countries' histories and cultures. It makes it politically very difficult to change them. And also, you have people who've grown comfortable with that set of regulations. The idea that a government is going to change its regulations because somebody on the outside, i.e. Britain, is asking them to, is politically very complicated. Add to that the fact that Britain is very competitive in services. So if you open your market up to the Brits, there's a big chance they will be a serious, serious competitor. And the British market for services is already open, so you don't have to give very much up to get access to the British service markets. So the truth of the matter is that it's going to be very difficult to get much progress in services. We're going to get some. There's going to be little areas where we can cooperate, but it's not wholesale. The great magic, in a sense, of the European Union single market was it was able to create a table with so many issues on it that everybody could find something that more or less made it worthwhile participating, even though they had to accept some regulations that they didn't like. Now, the Brits have pulled out of that because that didn't work for them, but that's it was a very, by a long way, the most comprehensive trade agreement on services. So I don't expect to see huge progress in Asia. I expect to see some. Freedom to trade with the US, more benefits to British economies. The government's own study of the benefits, economic benefits of trading with the US was that it would raise, in the long term, it would raise British GDP, total output, by 0.2%. That's 2 1/1000ths. Not very much, partly because the US is a long way away, partly because the US is already pretty open. And in the places where it's not open, it's not likely to open up because the Brits are pressing. We're not big enough to have attractions that will make them give very much. A number of US regulations are really not very attractive to Britain, and they are rather restrictive of imports from Britain. Think about the Food and Drug Administration, the difficulties they're making over, say, approving the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. There's nothing wrong with that. You can be very cautious, but they're not going to give that up because we ask them, even if we ask nicely. So US, trade agreement with the US, pretty nice. Let's have it, as long as it doesn't undermine a lot of things that British care about, like ownership, or actually who operates the National Health Service, or drug pricing, or food standards. But it's not, again, going to stimulate exports fantastically. Scotland leaving. You're a cheerful lot, aren't you? Yeah, Scotland leaving the Union. Traditionally, we used to think of the Scots going off to run the British Empire. And so if the Scots aren't going to do it, who is going to do this sort of bombastic stuff? I don't know. It will make a bit of difference. The Scots have typically been quite outward looking, but in the end, economically, Scotland is not big enough, I think, to overturn the general thrust of British policy. What is clear, I think, is if Scotland leaves the Union, and then almost certainly, if we're honest, going to be followed by Northern Ireland, Britain, England and Wales, what remains, is going to be run by the current party that is in government, basically forevermore. The Conservatives have basically a built-in majority in England. So we are going to get more of the sort of policies that we've seen over the last 10 years. Our autarkic village. Okay, so is the UK taking a political stance to shift its trade policy with a focus on emerging markets rather than the developed EU? Yes, I mean, Britain is doing its best, and this is really what Global Britain is about. It's doing its best to move away from Europe. What I'm saying is actually it's not going to do so. So you mentioned Ghana and Kenya, agreements within Africa. Typically, Ghana, Kenya, nearly all Africa had trade relations with the EU, which were sort of complicated but not very demanding. Britain has just tried to replicate those. It's done nothing to improve them, and it seems they didn't want to. At the start of Brexit, I argued very fiercely with the British government that here was the opportunity to make the relationship with developing countries better. They didn't want to do it. I think they thought they wouldn't have the bandwidth to be able to work out what to do, and I think that's proved to be the case. I'm hopeful that come back in 10 years' time, we actually will have a somewhat different relationship with lower income developing countries. But for now, you are exactly right that the government is dreaming of, as it were, getting into the trading with rapidly growing emerging markets. We probably will improve our trade with them. But again, distance probably means not by a huge amount. Yes, so somebody's asked, I said that Britain is pretty global economically, but the majority of it trade with the EU. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. But, contrary to what Mr. Johnson thinks, Europe is part of the world. And in a sense, this geography that it's there, big, rich, similar to us, means I think that we're always going to trade more with it. You might not think that's as global as you would wish, but frankly, an economy the size of the UK, excuse me, is not going to be a huge partner for countries much further away. We'll have some influence and be of some interest, but we are not large enough to trade over those huge distances at massive amounts. So I think when we talk about being open to the world, typically you are open to your closer neighbors before you become open to a greater extent than you're open with your distant friends. And so I don't see the fact that most of our trade is with Europe as sort of as a counterpoint to having a global view. And think back to the slide that I had, which showed that we've been trading with Europe above 40% just about every year for the last 350 years. It does suggest that there's something, something about that. Oh, yes, right. Okay, the best and worst impact of Brexit for Britain itself. I think my answer is, don't get me going on that. I think Brexit was a pretty unattractive piece of economic policy. It may just be that in time we get around to having a slightly healthier labour market because we don't have, as it were, open to a whole flood of people coming in from the EU whenever we try to raise wages. But I'm not at all persuaded that that's actually going to happen. So I think, by and large, Brexit is something, that would have been better avoided. The worst part, I think, in the long run, unless they follow my advice and lots of other people's advice to work really hard on the relationship with Europe, is actually that we'll drift away from Europe and become more and more idiosyncratic and isolated in terms of our services and the positions that we adopt. Which sectors provide the best opportunity for export growth? Well, probably they are service sectors for the UK. If we can try, as countries get richer, emerging markets, they typically import or consume more services. That opens up to imports if you can persuade them to open their markets up. It's also the case that I think we feel that digitization, which is sort of proceeding apace now, will probably have a larger effect on services exports than on goods exports. And so I think you are looking at the services. The areas where Britain is sort of preeminently strong are finance, but that's very heavily regulated, and professional services, sort of including cultural things. Finance is a political football, so I think probably it's sort of professional services if I had to back anything at all. Excuse me. Well, Britain might start to think about rejoining the EU. I don't think it will happen for 30 years or so. I mean, it's conceivable that when we get over COVID, we discover that Brexit is so uncomfortable that there is an immediate rethink, but I think that's extremely unlikely. And once that immediate sort of shock has passed, what we're going to find is that you're waiting for a whole generation of sort of politicians or even people with political consciousness to sort of pass through the system and move out the other end before they're sort of, the fact that they've supported Brexit and they've got Brexit is overcome to somebody else says, look, wouldn't it be sensible to be on the inside? Rejoining the EU would be a shock to our sovereignty, much greater in a sense than the sovereignty that we gained by coming out. Because Britain had a lot of carve-outs in Europe. We weren't part of the euro, we weren't part of the social chapter, and so it went on. If we rejoined, we'd have to join all those things. And so it will be a bigger step on sovereignty than we've had in the last few years. So I don't honestly, I should also say, if you look at Switzerland, which has a relationship, probably the most similar one to the one that the UK has with Europe at the moment, they spend their whole lives negotiating with the European Union. But interestingly, politically, that has not led to pro-European sentiment of the Swiss saying, let's get on the inside. It actually has exacerbated anti-European sentiment because the Europeans are always the difficulty. The Swiss want to do something, the Europeans won't let them. That's how it's presented. And so I expect that also to go on in Britain, that we're going to have this constant renegotiation, constant frictions, and that's going to feed the narrative that this is a nasty little group and we don't want to be part of it. So I think the future with Europe is a much more an arm's length sort of constructive one, but where we recognize there's a lot of give and take, a lot of quiet work that doesn't hit the political headlines. Is the world excited for global Britain? The world has hardly noticed. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, Britain is less than 3% of world GDP. We're not changing the amount that we trade very much. So the rest of the world is yawning. It's very difficult for the Brits to accept, but I'm afraid that's the truth. Brexit is in favour of the UK. Is Britain the beneficiary of Brexit? I think very strongly not. You see, I think economically it's costly. Almost every economist agrees. And what we haven't seen is now you've got all this sovereignty, what are you going to do with it? I just haven't heard plans that we are going to do this, which previously the EU stopped us from doing. So by and large, I'm not a fan of Brexit. I understand it's happened, we can't go back. It's just part of the environment. But I think we're all going to be somewhat poorer for it. And then there's a last question. Is a Kanzuk union something Britain should pursue now out of the EU? We ought to have a sensible, constructive relationship with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. They're countries that speak the same language, so we sort of understand each other. We have cultural similarities. Canada, Australia are not that different from the UK in terms of economic size. So yes, we certainly should view them as like-minded partners in lots of things. Do we want to formalize that further than we formalize it now through, say, the Five Eyes in security? I wouldn't be very excited about doing it. I can see it's just possible that we would have some benefits from that, but the idea that somehow what essentially is the old Commonwealth is going to look to Britain for leadership and will fall in behind what Britain wants to achieve internationally is an idea for the birds. Canada and Australia are large enough to have worked out how they want to run their international relations. And frankly, the arrival of Britain on the scene saying, follow me, follow me, follow me, they're just going to shrug. So I wouldn't go out of my way. We have a trade agreement with Canada. We're going to have trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand. What we should then focus on is trying to, as a group, help to form sort of sensible rules among like-minded countries. When I say like-minded, I mean sort of relatively liberal, relatively open countries. Try to be big advocates for global rules, big advocates for the rule of law, and so on. I think it will be a very useful group, but I wouldn't necessarily put effort into formalizing it. Okay, look, I've detained you longer than you bargained for. I apologize for that, but thank you very much for staying. Thank you for listening. Very good questions, lots to talk about. It's what we do in Sussex. Please do think hard about these things. We live in a global world. The technology has just made us global. What we've got to do is learn to live with it in a sensible way. And I'm too old to do much about it now. You are not. So sort of think hard and act wisely. So with that, let me say thank you very much and have a good day.